1930s. Extremism, civil war and revolution raged across much of Europe.
Spain's atrocity-spangled civil war burns and butchers into its 9th week. And yet both sides claim to be fighting for the good of Spain.
But Britain was undergoing an upheaval of its own.
We had our revolution here without the help of murder. 1 million people exchanged slum for sun.
Oh, the new house. As far as I'm concerned, it was a new life.
For Bob Coote and his family, like thousands of others in Britain at the time, life was good.
For the first time we had electricity, new electric cooker, which was a work of art.
Cooking's just become a matter of pressing the right button. Look here.
And of course we had a front and back garden. Never had our own garden before.
It's an unfamiliar picture of 1930s Britain, at odds with the accepted view of the hungry 30s. The devil's decade.
Hunger marches, mass unemployment, closed shipyards and derelict factories. And it's an image that really remains deeply rooted in the British consciousness. There are no comparable statements which talk about the affluence, the confidence, the rising living standards, the improved quality of personal leisure that actually characterised the 1930s for most people during that decade.
It was a period of growth and prosperity, of shopping and leisure.
This, after all, is the time when the British people became the avid consumers that, frankly, we are today.
For many, the 1930s was a golden age.
I wouldn't minimise it for those affected. It was very serious for places like Jarrow and so on, and the people there had very good reason to be unhappy, but that was not the general mood of the country. The country itself was prosperous and happy. For many people, it was an age if you've never had it so good.
In the autumn of 1933, the popular Yorkshire novelist and playwright J.B. Priestley embarked on a journey around the country, turning his eye on the state of the nation. What confronted him was strangely unfamiliar, the modern world of a new Britain. It was, he concluded,
the new post-war England of arterial and bypass roads, of filling stations and factories that look like exhibition buildings, of giant cinemas and dance halls and cafes, bungalows with tiny garages, cocktail bars, Woolworths, and factory girls looking like actresses.
Priestley's image of 1930s Britain contrasts with the grim portrait of poverty and unemployment painted by George Orwell.
The monstrous scenery of slag heaps, chimneys, piled scrap iron, foul canals, paths of cindery mud crisscrossed by the print of clogs. As we moved slowly through the outskirts of town, we passed row after row of little grey slum houses running at right angles to the embankment.
Two worlds, Priestley's wealthy and vibrant, Orwell's poor and distressed. Britain was a country in flux, in which two nations coexisted.
I'll have to see my broker, find out what he can do.
Unlike many other countries, Britain avoided the worst effects of the Wall Street crash in 1929. This was thanks, in large part, to the actions of its national government.
1931, the year of coalition, the critical time all over the world when nations' finances were falling like leaves in autumn.
You're going up, up, up in my estimation.
In 1931, a coalition government was formed to see Britain through the Depression. At its helm was the Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. But the man responsible for safeguarding Britain's economic future was its Iron Chancellor, Neville Chamberlain. He came to the post late in life. he was 62 years old.
Neville Chamberlain's always had a bad press, I think, for almost everything he did. And people focus a great deal on the period when he was Prime Minister. What they forget, I think, is his role as Chancellor of the Exchequer for much of the 1930s, in which he was, I think, enormously successful.
People of this country have been very brave and very patient.
Neville Chamberlain was an extremely good, competent and dynamic Chancellor. He was the Gordon Brown of his era. He's a Chancellor of the Exchequer who would brook no interference in his management of the economy. And when anybody tried, they were pretty brutally slapped down.
Chamberlain had hinterland. Outside politics, he had many hobbies. He loved Shakespeare and Beethoven, collected orchids, and was a passionate countryman. As Chancellor, his main goal was to save Britain's economy.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer, with Mrs. Neville Chamberlain, stands on the steps of his residence, smilingly facing the great exposure by cinematograph and pressman.
In response to the slump, Chamberlain put up trade barriers, reduced public spending, cut benefits, and slashed interest rates. Prosperity returned. By 1934, the domestic economy was booming.
We are beginning to get the reward of my obstinacy in sticking to sound finance and your patience and courage in bearing your burdens all this time.
Using the newsreels, Chamberlain boasted to the nation of his achievements.
Another surplus? How on earth do you manage it? That's a question which I'm told has been very often asked of Englishmen by foreigners, ever since the news was published that we'd finished up last year with over 7.5 million to spare.
While wages remained more or less the same, the cost of living fell. Those with jobs had more to spend.
Insofar as you're a consumer, it's a good period because your money is buying more in terms of goods and services.
But whilst Chamberlain's economic policies had a positive effect for the majority, they did very little to help the industrial wastelands of Britain.
If you looked at, say, Jarrow, the shipbuilding town, at its very worst, it shows an unemployment rate of about 60%. Now, an expanding, prosperous southeastern town like, say, St Albans, where unemployment about 3 to 4% at the same time. Now, those are extremes, admittedly, but it does give you some idea of just how wide the disparity was.
Some regions of Britain seemed to be in terminal decline, pockets of poverty, isolated from the wealth and progress in the rest of the country.
The problems facing the old industrial regions in Britain really stemmed almost from before the First World War. They produced goods which other developed states were beginning to produce as well. There were fewer markets for Britain's steel or its coal or its ships and so on. So the rot has set in long before the Wall Street crash and the Depression of the 1930s.
These were the old industries of Victorian Britain. But times were changing. In the south, new technologies were bringing a boom that would change Britain forever.
Cheer up, sun's in the sky. Why should you and I be feeling sad? Cheer up, never say die. Make this year the best you've ever had. Old man prosperity is gonna shake hands with you and me.
One can see the symptoms of prosperity along some of the new arterial roads that are being constructed, especially in London and the southeast of England.
Bold new architecture and road construction transformed the countryside and cityscapes. Elaborate factories and offices went up.
The eyes of the world are on you.
With sleek lines and shiny surfaces, they were a celebration of modernity.
Of all the what perfection should be.
And the companies that owned them were a new breed. Currys, Gillette, Hoover.
One only has to look at the Hoover factory to see the confidence, the opulence of that building. There's nothing depressed or mean or small about this. This is a statement that this is a new industry, developing new markets for new types of consumers.
The world around you. There isn't a nation in all this creation where you're not among the who's who. Is it any?
Modern Britain was coming out from the shadow of its Victorian past on a wave of prosperity. And underpinning this new prosperity was the biggest private housing boom of all time. Developers built nearly 3 million new houses in the 1930s, taking advantage of low interest rates and cheaper building materials. While the architecture of the new industries embraced a bold Art Deco modernity, private housing looked back to a more traditional England.
It is said that there were more Tudor-type houses built in the interwar period than there were in the Tudor period. They used gables, leaded windows,
steeply pitched roofs, nice porches, often a little bit of coloured glass.
This popular mock Tudor style was dubbed Tudor-Beathen, reflecting a widespread nostalgia, a modern Britain, but one that was seeking comfort in the security of its past. These houses may have recalled Old England, but they also embraced the modern world.
Happy in the morning, 'cause the water's hot. We can bath an army, the effort does a lot. Happy.
New housing boasted indoor plumbing and hot water systems,
Dirty, greasy dishes are left without a blot.
proper kitchens, and greater living space.
Saving money.
It was a huge improvement. Poor housing with outdoor sanitation, cold water and coal fires had blighted the country for years. Now, something was being done about it. Betty Clark's family lived in a small flat in Hackney, East London, during the 1920s and early 1930s.
It was very crowded, lots of families all living together, and we had just 2 bedrooms. And there were 3 brothers, my mum and dad and myself, and we all lived in this little tiny flat. Very uncomfortable.
For families like Betty's, the prospect of moving out of the inner cities and into a new house in the suburbs was a dream. But by the 1930s, it was an increasingly affordable dream, as building societies offered cheaper mortgages.
The weekly payment towards the mortgage would probably be about 14 or 15 shillings. And you could now pay it back over 25 years, whereas previously 15 years had been more normal term.
You could actually buy a house in the 1930s, a 3-bedroom semi, for pretty much the same price that you could rent a larger council house.
So that puts a semi-detached house within range of not just middle-class people, but working men as well.
John Pritchard was 6 years old when his parents decided to move out of Silvertown in the Docklands area of East London.
I detested where we lived at Silvertown. It was very industrial along there. There was a great deal of pollution, very smoky, very dirty. My father spotted an advertisement in the paper for a new bungalow estate to be built, and he sent for the leaflet. We had to get the bus up from Woolwich, walk across the heath, and there, at the end of a field, there was 6 little bungalows, and I do mean in a field in those days. There were birds, butterflies, skylarks coming up out of the meadow in the day. You know, it's just all paradise as far as I was concerned. And on the way back to Woolwich, my father said to me, well, how would you like to live there? Oh, Dad, could we? Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful? And my father said, well, I've got to go home and do some sums before I know whether we can live there.
Betty Clark's family made the move from Hackney to the upmarket suburb of Walthamstow in 1932.
There was a lot of talk beforehand about, can we afford it? My dad was a bus driver, so he was in a regular job. But they decided in the end they could afford to go. It was going to be tough, but yes, they would move.
The deposit was £25 for the £500 bungalow. My father put £10 down and had to borrow the other £15 from an uncle of mine. My mother sold a few bits of her jewellery to pay for the removal van, and in due course we all moved over here.
It was money well spent. Almost 80 years later, John still lives in the same bungalow.
Spring will soon come smiling down the lane. Hallelujah, I'm myself again.
For hundreds of thousands of people all over Britain, home ownership offered the promise of a better life, away from the cities.
People spoke about moving out to find Devon at your door. I mean, this is only Surrey we're talking about, but this was the sort of vision that they tried to propagate.
You could develop a new life in a semi-rural environment where you would have a house which was larger and critically would have a bathroom, hot running water and a large back garden.
Oh, the garden. You were able to go out there and sit out in the sun, which I did a lot. I loved sitting out there. And of course the joy of hanging your washing out in the garden, you know, pegging your washing out on a big line, that was lovely, seeing it all going in the breeze.
300,000 private houses were built each year. Rather than spending money on public housing, the Conservative Neville Chamberlain encouraged home ownership as a step towards a property-owning democracy.
There was a feeling that better housing would create better citizens. It would create people who had a stake in society. It would create people who lived better lives, who would look after their environment better because they had something to look after.
The landscape of Britain was changing. A commuter belt sprung up around the prosperous big cities, especially in the south.
A vast transport system has grown up for a population which lives in one part of London and works in another.
It was the golden age of London Underground.
Over 2.5 million people are brought into London every morning. Fast underground trains cope with nearly 500,000 in the space of an hour.
Access to a tube network, the London Underground, was particularly important. So the extension of lines such as the Piccadilly line into new suburban areas opened up those areas very rapidly to new suburban development.
The number of passengers carried by trains, trams and buses in the course of a year is 3 times the population of the globe.
Piccadilly line stations were built with little expense spared, monuments to the prosperity of the new suburbia.
We're always on the outside, always looking in.
Suburban-dwelling white-collar workers could kiss their families goodbye before hopping on a train to work. Even the journey to the station was becoming easier. Advertisers encouraged Britain's housewives to drive their husbands there in brand new motor cars.
Nowadays, with the spread of the suburbs, the station may be some distance from your house. It's so much safer to keep that precious husband of yours out of crowded buses and run him by car to the station. After all, the poor man has to work so hard all day, so he says.
Motoring fundamentally changed from the privilege of a few to the aspiration of the many.
You turn your head as I pass you by. You can't deny, you turn your head.
Mass assembly production lines were for the first time used to produce cars in a big way. In 1934, for example, the Morris factory at Cowley in Oxford creates a moving assembly line for production, and with this, of course, and economies of scale from increased demand, you get a reduction in the unit price of cars.
Speeding along the rolling highways, singing a song to the rhythm of the moon, the sun's in the sky, a heaven afloat.
Car ownership more than doubled over the course of the decade. For Paul Vaughan's family, it offered a newfound freedom.
We had a car and we used to drive out to towns in the near vicinity like Esher and Guildford, and sometimes to the coast for the day on a Sunday and take a picnic, and that was wonderful.
The car was a huge symbol in the 1930s. I mean, I remember my father telling me that one of his family's proudest moments in 1938, I think it was, they were the first owners of a car on their council estate. And that, they were royalty. They were the Rothschilds of West Earlham.
Everybody dreamed of a new car to go with their new house, even if they couldn't quite afford it.
The best houses costing, say, £1,000 would come with garages. Houses in the intermediate category, say £800, would often not have a garage, but they'd have a space for a garage. And this ability to either have a car in a garage or move to having a car in a garage was seen as the gold standard of the middle-class suburban life, the thing people aspired to, even if they couldn't actually achieve it at the time they bought the house.
The car may have been the gold standard of suburban living, but there were other, more affordable inventions which made life easier. And these were carefully marketed to a willing audience.
The Ideal Home Exhibition again. Here, in a graceful little speech, Mrs. Neville Chamberlain declares the exhibition open.
This exhibition will give fresh inspiration and be of the greatest practical value to all those who love their homes.
Marguerite Patton was a home economist during the 1930s. She worked for Eastern Electric and Frigidaire.
Every year, we used to have this wonderful, wonderful Daily Mail Ideal Home Exhibition at Olympia. It was part of my job as a home economist to learn about it.
And there were always lots of new gadgets. My mother was a sucker for that sort of thing.
The modern kitchen reveals some very novel gadgets. This toast rack, for instance, with a spring that holds firmly the thin, medium or doorstep variety.
They would show you how to make food, and then it was all handed round to you to taste. So, of course, everybody crowded for all these demonstrations, you see, so you got a taster.
They were opening out to people who'd never seen things like that, what life could be like. If you never had a vacuum cleaner, all you do is to push it and it picks up the dust. No more brushing. Absolutely splendid.
By 1938, the Ideal Home Exhibition was attracting 600,000 visitors.
You could line up for 2 hours to go and see the new houses, which gave you wonderful ideas for your own place, of course, but it never worked out like that at all.
The exhibition is full of ideal homes which you must visit to see, but we give you a glimpse of the lovely gardens, for what is a home without a garden?
Beautiful gardens, but you paid extra to go into these gardens, but they were wonderful. It had rivers through them and crowds of people went there to see what was going on.
People would go around these dream houses with all, of course, fully fitted and fully kitted. There'd be tremendous pressure then, of course, to buy. It was an enormous draw for people. I mean, it was dreamland.
These appliances rapidly became an essential part of modern living, marketed just as aggressively as the house itself. Their price and convenience were the result of the other great revolution of the decade, the extension of the electricity supply.
The national grid was completed in 1933. Massive power lines are running the whole length and breadth of the country.
It's striking to remember that up to the First World War, about 2% of all British houses were wired for electricity.
By 1930, that had increased to 1 in 3. By 1939, that had increased to 2 out of 3 houses had electricity. This fundamentally transformed the quality of human life in the 1930s.
Electricity brought within reach of all. An invisible inheritance flowing through overhead wires and underground mains to the doorsteps of industry and the home.
The magic of just touching a switch and the light coming on, you know, for a while it was unbelievable.
For many housewives, although electricity was a boon, it was also a venture into the unknown.
I can remember my own grandmother was very afraid of electricity throughout her life.
In planning the new homes of Britain, this time we must not forget that the planned installation of electricity is of paramount importance.
And perhaps rightly in some cases, because the wiring wasn't always perfect.
The electricity and gas suppliers employed demonstrators who were often women to go around and show how you could cook recipes, how you could use the cooker effectively.
This lady has very kindly been telling me how to get the best out of my cooker. Have you got an electric cooker like this one? Rather. I've had mine for years.
I found myself as a young cook having to go and cook a dinner party for 10 people to show how to use the electric cooker. And I even to have to wash up afterwards, but that was part of the service, a wonderful service we gave. Though we were called home economists and we did a lot of cooking and demonstrating, at the back of it, we were selling appliances. We were demonstrating to sell.
It's also cheap, clean, safe, simple, and quick with an electric cooker.
The country was changing. The housing boom, electricity and mass production were transforming society. But this was not all. Neville Chamberlain always put the economy first, but he also prided himself as a social reformer with a vision of a new Britain.
The people must be strong and healthy. If they should fall victim to accident or disease, they must have the best that is available of medical science. They must command an income sufficient to maintain themselves and their families, at least in a minimum state of comfort.
His ultimate objective is always to make Britain a better place. To improve the condition of the people was one of his favourite phrases. He says this is what brought him into public life in the first place, and he believes that having stewarded the economy to prosperity, he would then be able to use the fruits of that prosperity to improve the condition of the people.
Chamberlain oversaw a range of social reforms that were to change British society.
Let's all get together with this one thought in mind. Make this world a better, brighter place.
The 1930s saw the introduction of the 8-hour day and 48-hour week, an expansion in national insurance, greater access to hospitals and midwives, the contributory old age pension, and the introduction of holiday pay.
Those are the conditions we should like to see in this country of ours.
These policies had far-reaching consequences, both for 1930s society and for the birth of modern Britain.
I think it would be fair to call the 30s the unrealised decade, if you like, because an awful lot of the ideas, the blueprints, the superstructures of what in fact would become the welfare state after the Second World War were already in place in the 30s.
For a long time, the history of the post-1945 Labour government has been, of course, the history of a government that took a Britain damaged by war and unemployment, transformed it, created a health service, provided welfare and so on. This is a myth. To imagine that the Labour government invented this from the ground up, of course, is an illusion.
Home again and free. Free to enjoy this
the social and economic revolution of the 30s was not universally popular. Many contemporary authors found much to dislike about the New Britain.
Betjeman says at one point, "I see the cities of the future, chum. The workers' flats in fields of soya beans." Suburbia wasn't quite like that, but I think he disliked the idea of all those red rooftops and all the identical sort of chalets, so-called, stretching for miles across the countryside.
Housing estates sprung up across the country, with few planning laws to keep them in check. Many, from left-wing ramblers to Tory landowners, saw their precious countryside threatened.
Many miles of country lanes are to be widened into main road. When the scheme is complete, here is just one of the gardens that will disappear completely before the all-conquering concrete. Help save rural England.
One of the concerns about the housing boom, of course, is where are the houses going to go? And they're going to go away from the city centres. They're going to go into areas that were small villages. And it does provoke those kinds of anxieties that we're familiar with today, that somehow or other the countryside is under threat. The environment is going to be polluted by suburbia.
George Orwell had been outraged by the plight of the old industrial regions. But he was equally horrified by the explosion of uniform housing and homogeneous lives in suburban Britain.
Do you know the road I live in? Ellesmere Road, West Bletchley. Even if you don't, you know 50 others exactly like it. You know how these streets fester all over the inner-outer suburbs. Always the same. Long, long rows of little semi-detached houses, as much alike as council houses, and generally uglier. The stucco front, the creosoted gate, the privet hedge, the green front door.
Every house was exactly like the one next door. They were like peas in a pod all the way down the road.
What distressed Orwell and Betjeman was the uniformity of it, the sense that everybody was listening to the sort of same slightly vacuous programmes on the light programme, the sense that everybody was reading the same, more or less, sort of not very demanding books. With the illusion of comfort and security, any kind of freedom and independence was being quashed.
Modernity left Orwell perplexed. He hated the destruction of the countryside, but he also detested the inequality of British society.
This is the great dilemma that faces those commentators of the time, in that you want an awful lot of things blown away, and you want them blown away by money and better living conditions and better sanitation. When those things come, they're going to blow a lot of other things away that you prefer to keep. Affluence can only be brought to the majority of the people by the mass market culture that you, as an intellectual, despise. And what are you going to do about that?
Orwell may have agonised over this dilemma, but Britain's new homeowners enthusiastically embraced the dream. As living standards improved, families became smaller. The Duke and Duchess of York and their 2 daughters embodied the ideal of a nuclear family.
We liked them as a family. They were a picture book family. You know, father the Duke of York, mother the Duchess of York, and 2 enchanting little girls. Oh, they were lovely. Sort of family that everybody would like.
Daily life became centred on the home and family, rather than the street and the extended community. Many people welcomed this change. Home ownership was a sign of respectability. Betty Clark's mother was not unusual in her outlook.
She didn't mix with people. She didn't like if people came and knocked on the door and said, "Can you lend me a bowl of sugar?" She thought that was awful. But this is how it was in Hackney, you know. People did things for each other. And you didn't get that when you went to Walthamstow. People kept themselves to themselves, more or less. You didn't get people knocking on your door.
My mother, who was more snobbish than my father, used to say, "Don't play with him." And why not? They're common, you know. And to be common was the most awful crime, you know. And so we had to choose our friends so that they would be people my mother wouldn't object to.
Home ownership fueled the British obsession with class. With it came the inevitable pressure to keep up with the Joneses.
Conspicuous consumption is something that's working its way into the national psyche at this time, and so comparing one's own expenditure with that of other people unavoidably comes with it.
It is one of the great ages of middle-class aspiration. It's full of people just wanting to have some slight advantage over the person who lives next door.
Big town, my pockets I thought you'd fill, a mansion upon a hill. I felt like Jack and Jill, small town.
For many, particularly those who had stretched themselves to buy their house, this pressure took its toll.
Not many people had got all the stuff they needed to move in. They moved in either with nothing or as they could build it up. I know people who started up with packing cases to sit on when they moved in.
For those unable to afford the status symbols of suburban life, there was always the lure of hire purchase, payment by instalment. It was the beginning of a very modern addiction to credit.
One of the great symbols in the 1930s is the hire purchase arrangement and the stores where you could buy a sofa that would impress the neighbours on the Never Never.
I know Mother had never done it until she bought a new three-piece suite, and Mother had ambitions to have something nice and new for her new house. So I remember going with her and looking at them, and her signing the form.
More than £100 million a year was spent on hire purchase, roughly £4 billion in today's prices. Advertising encouraged Britain's consumers to spend, even if they didn't have the cash. But despite the popularity of HP, to speak of it was taboo.
Having a large radio was seen as a real status symbol. However, if you were to be seen as buying that on the Never Never, and were putting your family's future at risk if you couldn't keep up with the payments, that was seen as being extremely profligate. So the trick was to be able to buy it in secrecy, so that the neighbours wouldn't know. They may suspect it, but as long as they had no evidence, then you could get the social prestige without the social stigma.
The shops were careful not to embarrass their customers.
Companies which marketed goods on hire purchase tended to stress secrecy. One of the real pioneers of this was the furniture retailer Drake's.
Well, I hadn't any money, so my wife flew in a rage. She said there's nothing for it but to go to Mr. Drake.
Whose advert stated boldly, "We guarantee delivery in plain vans." It was stressed that your neighbours wouldn't have to know. No references asked for.
Mr. Drake, beautiful glages, that's the place to furnish if you're poor. Be it ever so humble, or be it a mansion, for they always lay a lino on the floor.
HP was popular, but it was open to abuse by the lending companies.
It was a disastrous system for many people because goods could be repossessed even if you'd paid nearly the entire amount of repayments if you fell behind perhaps just for a week. I mean, there were dreadful stories.
Repossessing goods before the final payment was a notorious scam, known as the snatchback.
And they were perfectly legally entitled to do so, because the contract stipulated you must meet the payments on time. They didn't need a court order because it was still technically the property of the dealer.
Hire purchase was a way of having a more comfortable home, of acquiring things, but it could also be a very difficult trap and a very pernicious trap.
It wasn't until 1938 that regulations were passed to stem unfair practices. Then, as now, the ready availability of consumer credit fueled a boom in consumption. It was the birth of mass consumerism and a love affair with shopping.
It really is in the interwar period that shopping became a sort of national, not just a hobby and a necessity, but almost an occupation for many people.
As suburbia swelled, so too did the range and number of chain stores and department stores competing to sell to the new home-owning masses.
New stores, all of them clean and healthy and efficient, and of course, all of them exceedingly good for trade.
In the 20s and more so in the 1930s, we see a movement towards leisure-based shopping. And the people who really succeed in marketing this to a mass audience are Woolworths and Marks and Spencer.
There's a wonderful emporium just opened in our town by a celebrated merchant prince of very great renown. It's owned by Mr. Woolworth and it's like Aladdin's cave. There's everything you want there from the cradle to the grave.
I suppose I would go into Woolworths 5 times out of 10 on the way home from school just to have a look around. And of course it was all open plan and the young ladies behind the counter and everything was on display.
And there's nothing over 6 in the stores.
And the idea is that people can go, look at the counters, the goods are visibly displayed, and they can pick them up and inspect them with no obligation to buy. And this is extremely popular.
In Britain, stores like Boots, Woolworths, John Lewis and Marks and Spencer were doing better than ever.
Marks and Spencer's built something like 129 new stores between 1931 and 1935. They extended another 60 stores. That meant that during the 1930s, Marks and Spencer's turnover went from about 2.5 million to 23.5 million in one decade, a 10 times increase in turnover.
Shopping was just one way that people spent their free time.
I can swing along through anything, and skies will be sunny and blue, just as long as the world goes round and around, and I go around with you.
People had more paid holidays, hours of work were on a downward trend, and new forms of leisure such as camping, caravanning, hiking, dancing really began to take off.
For the first time, holidays became a common feature of family life, helped by a new benefit.
Holidays with pay. Who says the world doesn't progress? The machinery of industry comes to a stop, and when the men and women who tend it take their week's money, there's the extra bonus this year to cover the holiday.
Well, this year we've got holidays with pay. Look at it. Woo! Isn't that lovely?
Every year we went to the seaside for our holidays. We usually went to the same place. We went to Margate for many years in succession, and then we shifted our allegiance to Sandown. Then we always went to the same hotel. I think it was called the Esplanade Hotel, near the pier, and we were welcomed there always every year, and we used to love it, my brother and I.
By the late 1930s, 20 million people visited the seaside annually. Blackpool had over 7 million visitors in 1937, 500,000 over the August bank holiday alone. But despite the gaiety of fun fairs, seaside holidays and high street spending sprees, something more sinister had begun to take hold. A growing sense of anxiety about the state of the world.
There were good things, pleasant things like Amy Johnson, the Ideal Home, the Olympics, etc. But running underneath that, I think we all felt a feeling of not being secure.
Alongside the material prosperity of the time, there was a general pessimism about the future.
There was this deep moral crisis, this feeling in the 1930s that everything, capitalism, international order, everything was going wrong.
Ironically, people's anxieties were now fueled by the very technologies that had helped improve their quality of life.
This is London calling. The Prime Minister will broadcast to the nation at 9:30 this evening.
By the late 1930s, nearly 9 million households had licences for wireless. It's cheap and it's almost universal in the country. It's terribly important.
It's estimated that by 1935, some 98% of the population could listen to at least one BBC station.
In the evenings, it becomes a centre for the family's social life. They gather round it, usually to listen to the light music put out by the BBC.
We used to tune in, as they say, every evening. We were fans of the BBC Dance Orchestra, and while other children were listening to Children's Hour, we tuned into Henry Hall, or before him, Jack Payne.
Hello everyone, this is Henry Hall speaking. The BBC Dance Orchestra is going to play to you Piccadilly Ride.
Radio was a major form of entertainment, but it also made people confront a new and dark world. National and global events were suddenly much more accessible.
We would all huddle round the radio at 9 o'clock at night for the news.
You could get your doom and gloom at first hand if you've got a wireless.
I mean, everything went quiet and we would listen to the news most religiously.
Alongside the radio, there was another form of mass media, the cinema.
The 1930s was the golden age of the cinema. Our cinemas were opening something like 3 a week. The total number of admissions was running at something like 23 million admissions per week.
Grand new picture palaces offered an escape from the real world in the most opulent and luxurious surroundings. But they also fueled the anxiety of the interwar generation, whether about international politics or the ongoing suffering of their fellow countrymen.
And I shall always see the faces of those Jarrow marchers at the cinema. And we'd seen a picture in the newspaper and we realised that they were absolutely desperate. Not a hope of a job, not really much hope at all. But when you saw their faces, I can remember the gasp that went round the cinema. You looked at people who were really, really suffering.
I can remember seeing them with all their banners, and some of them didn't even have shoes. I can remember that, boots on their feet. And I can remember my dad saying, those poor people, he was so terribly sorry for them.
For many, these images were the first glimpse they had of this strange other Britain.
Clydebank, Jarrow, South Wales, places like this, and they were cut off from the mainstream of life. All those people who, never having it so good in St Albans, never saw the plight of the mass unemployed until they saw the occasional hunger march. And of course the hunger marches were designed specifically to bring to the public attention the plight of these areas that many people had simply forgotten about.
If Jarrow seemed like another country, Europe appeared uncomfortably close.
Night after night, all over Spain, men are torn from their weeping families, lined up and shot. Scores of cities, towns and villages have been bombarded and burnt.
You saw on the newsreels the things building up. The war between fascism and the others. You've got the Spanish Civil War. Italy invaded Abyssinia and then Albania, and that made war news. They were the sort of practice wars, getting ready for the real show.
Britain remained largely untainted by political extremism. But across Europe, the rise of dictators seemed to be dragging the whole world toward the precipice.
Initially, the anxiety was mainly economic. The possibility of losing your job, things of that kind were things, that concerned people. But as we gradually got more prosperous work-wise, people did become concerned about war because they'd got more to lose. If the house was bombed and you lost it, you would be in the position we were in 1941 of still owing 10 years of mortgage on a pile of rubble, and that was not funny.
For we may never meet again.
A generation of Britons enjoying the fruits of a privately funded, credit-fueled domestic boom had a very real fear that their bubble might soon burst.
Until the last minute.
The prospect of war was bound up in many people's minds with the prospect of economic collapse, and the type of suburban, domesticated, moderately affluent lifestyle which had emerged in the 1930s could be lost.
We come and go like a ripple on a stream.
And the advances of the modern world, which had improved life for so many, suddenly seemed much more sinister.
Tomorrow may never come for all we know.
Science was both promise and threat, and I think that for people who thought about these things, this was a paradox. They couldn't see a way of resolving this paradox. That modernity, in fact, for all its wonderful achievements, actually contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction.
The mass production techniques which were being used to produce radios could also be used to produce munitions. Indeed, many of the factories had been munitions factories in the First World War.
The development of air travel in the 30s opened up the exciting possibility of foreign holidays. The wealthy could now fly to Europe or Africa within a matter of hours. But it also brought the spectre of bombing raids on civilian cities much nearer.
The Minister of War said, "No, the bomber will always get through," we were told.
Madrid, Barcelona, Guernica.
Aerial bombardment of civilian cities was used to devastating effect in the Spanish Civil War. The spectre of another conflict in Europe hung increasingly heavy over British society.
All the boys, when we went to school in the late 30s, would sometimes in the morning go in and say to one another, "Hello, cannon fodder," because that's what we thought we were.
By the mid-1930s, these fears grew as Britain began to rearm in response to German aggression and growing military strength.
Britain must be strong, and even the present rearmament programme must be speeded up. Production of armaments in all departments must be increased by national effort.
For Chamberlain, the need to rearm was a bitter blow, forcing him to divert money from social reform to strengthening Britain's defences.
Yes, I know. I feel just that way myself. Each of the 4 last budgets was a little better than the one before, and I did hope that the 5th was going to outclass all the others. Instead of that, well, there it is.
He genuinely wanted more social reform. He bitterly regretted the fact that this wasn't possible. And it does have a direct impact upon his policies. Chamberlain is a reluctant rearmer. He wants to spend enough to maintain national security, but he doesn't want to spend so much that it either dislocates the domestic economy or prevents social reform in the near future.
In an arming world, we couldn't be the only great country disarmed. We simply had to build our defence forces again, and we had to pay for it.
As the world moved closer to war, suburban Britain turned inwards, finding escapism in material prosperity.
The sort of jollity of the 1930s was, I think, partly occasioned by people thinking, enjoy ourselves now, another couple of years we might be dead.
Say to yourself, I will be happy, I will be happy today.
All over Britain, people had ambition to shut out the horrible things that were going on, the things that worried us so much. If you thought about a new suite or a new vacuum cleaner, that took your mind off it for a little while. You probably went back to worrying afterwards, but at least you had something to be pleased about.
But while much of Britain could shut out the horrible things, pockets of the country confronted them on a daily basis. In his desire to sustain the prosperity of the South, Neville Chamberlain was not merely a reluctant rearmer, he did almost nothing to help the old industrial regions.
Government policies for depressed areas were it was a bit like trying to hold back the tide. It was extremely difficult to find strategies which would ameliorate these kind of social effects, because it would involve breaking up societies, transforming their local culture. This was a slow and difficult process.
Faced with what he considered an impossible task, Chamberlain refused to plough government money into these areas. He left them to struggle on, largely unassisted.
I don't think there was a simple answer. It was, in a sense, an economy in transition, and that transition had to work itself out at a terrible human cost.
Chamberlain's failure to help the old industrial areas would overshadow his reputation as Chancellor, just as his policy of appeasement toward Hitler was to destroy his reputation as Prime Minister. For a man who steered Britain through a global depression and helped transform British society, some regard this as an injustice.
Had Neville Chamberlain died in 1937, he would have gone down to history as a great social reformer and a very competent Chancellor of the Exchequer. His misfortune was that he lived long enough to be Prime Minister in 1937, at a point when a nearly century-old tradition of appeasement in British foreign policy finally hits the buffers when he comes up against Hitler in 1938-39.
To preserve his economic achievements and to secure his goal of social reform, Chamberlain gambled everything on a desperate bid to maintain peace.
We had everything we wanted, perhaps more, and we had nothing to gain by war. We had only everything to lose by war. And Chamberlain recognises that if Britain goes to war, it will devastate its economy, it will ruin its greatness, it will jeopardise its empire, and it will turn us into a second-rate state. And the fact of the matter was, he was right.
When there was no option but to fight, Britain did so, and the successes and social developments of 1930s Britain were lost to 6 years of conflict.
The remarkable thing about the 30s is how quickly and how completely it all ended. It all ended, if you like, on the 7th of September 1940, the day Luftwaffe began attacking the London area. The dream of the property owning, the garden, the clean life, the nice life was, in a matter of weeks, was blown away. And 10,000 people died in the London area in the last 3 weeks of September 1940. Many more were made homeless and injured. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. Prosperity and the gaiety and so on came to a very quick and very complete end.
Good night, everybody. Good night.